Hi, this is Katie Mercier from the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. We're going to get started in a few minutes for the School to Prison Pipeline webinar. I just want to give people a couple minutes to sign in. And so we'll be mute for a little bit, and we'll be right back. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, this is Katie Mercier from CJJ, and welcome to the School to Prison Pipeline webinar. I just want to give you a few technical reminders before I hand it over to the presenters. First of all, you'll notice you're all in listen-only mode, that you're all muted right now. If you have a question, we're going to do questions at the end of the presentation, so you can either raise your hand at the end, or if you have a question, you can enter it at any time in the questions box, and at the end, we'll read it out loud. I would strongly encourage you to use the questions box if you're on a cell phone. That way we can avoid any kind of audio issues. We're also recording this webinar, so if you want to share with any of your colleagues, that will be up on the CJJ website in the next 24 hours. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex Carapoli from CJJ to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. So again, welcome to the School to Prison Pipeline webinar. We're really excited to have the presenters that we have today, and I'm just going to introduce them quickly. Kaitlin Banner is a staff attorney in the Ending the Jailhouse Crack program at the Advancement Project. Prior to joining the Advancement Project, Kaitlin was a clinical instructor at the Tuck Crowell Institute for At-Risk Youth at the UDC School of Law. Students in the clinic represent families in special education and school discipline cases and advocate for policies that promote positive interventions and enable students to continue their education. Kaitlin was also an Equal Justice Work Fellow at the ACLU in DC, where she founded the Fair Discipline Project and began working on school to prison pipeline issues. Kaitlin is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School's Juvenile Justice Clinic and GW Law School's School Scholarly Writing Program. Dr. Marsha Weissman is the founder and executive director of the Center for Community Alternatives. CCA provides alternative programs for youth and adults in the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Justice Strategies, CCA's Justice Strategies Policy Division, draws upon CCA's direct service experience to advance juvenile justice system reform. Dr. Weissman serves on the coordinating committee of the Dignity in Schools campaign and was a member of the New York State Task Force on Transforming Juvenile Justice. She's testified before the U.S. Senate on the problem of the school to prison pipeline and ways to reduce school suspensions. Dr. Weissman is the author of Prelude to Prison, Youth Perspectives on the School to Prison Pipeline, that will be published by the Syracuse University Press in early 2014. Harold Jordan is the community organizer for the ACLU of Pennsylvania. Harold brings three decades of experience working in nonprofit organizations to the ACLU. He's done extensive advocacy work on peace, youth leadership development, military service, and human rights issues. His past jobs include serving as the coordinator of a national program at the American Friends Service Committee, as a paralegal at the Legal Services of Philadelphia, the executive director of the National Coalition of Education Activists, as a computer programmer, and as an administrator in the School District of Philadelphia. Harold also serves on the leadership board of the Philadelphia Public School Notebook, an independent nonprofit news service reporting on public education, and is a leader in the National Dignity in Schools campaign. Fernando Martinez joined the Dignity in Schools campaign as the first national field organizer in April 2012. Fernando was born in El Salvador and continued his organizing career in the late 80s, organizing youth groups in churches throughout El Salvador during the Civil War. Later, he moved to the U.S. and continued his fight with different community-based in New York City, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Birmingham, Alabama, and Paterson, New Jersey. Fernando was the first organizer for the Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama, which fought back against back the first anti-immigration laws that preceded HB 66 in 2005. Fernando also started the Patterson chapter of the statewide Education Organizing Committee in New Jersey, where he successfully led, engaged, and organized parents to win 2 new projects for the city of Patterson and for the return of music and art programs to the classrooms. So once again, we're excited to have these presenters, and I'm going to turn it over to them to get started.
Hi, and can we move to, oh, there we go. So hi everyone, this is Kaitlin Banner. I'm really excited to have you all on the call today and really excited to be talking about the school to prison pipeline. And we're going to start by doing an overview of what the school to prison pipeline is, how the groups that are on the phone, how it's defined, and what the elements of it are. And then we're going to really move into talking about some of the on-the-ground movement to fight against the school to prison pipeline. And so we're really excited to talk about that and to open up questions. But as I said, first I'm going to start off by introducing the school to prison pipeline as a concept and to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say the school to prison pipeline. Next slide, please. And so the school to prison pipeline is really, as we define it, are policies and practices that exist that are directly and indirectly pushing students out of school and onto a pathway to prison. And we see this happening where students are moving both directly into the juvenile justice system from schools. So we'll talk a little bit today about the practice of using arrest to respond to school discipline incidents and the practice of young people who are getting hooked into the juvenile justice system through status offenses and things like that that are happening in their schools. But we'll also talk today about the indirect pathway that moves young people from school into a pathway to prison or a pathway to an unsuccessful, productive adult life. And what happens is that young people are often thrown off course by a disciplinary incident, by a suspension, an expulsion, or a school-based arrest, and that has really dramatic effects throughout their lifetime. Next slide. Some of the effects that we really see in the results of suspension and expulsion are that students who are suspended and expelled are more likely to be retained. They're more likely to be pushed out of school and not to graduate, and they're more likely to get arrested or referred to the juvenile delinquency system. So I wanted to give you all just some facts and figures on this. First of all, there's a recent study out of Florida that shows that getting suspended just once in 9th grade is associated with a 2-fold increase in the likelihood of dropping out. So students who are suspended just once have a 32% chance of dropping out of high school. And so we know that suspension is a trigger incident, is an indicative incident of what can happen. We also know from a really groundbreaking report in Texas by the Council for State Governors called Breaking Schools Rules that these things have been documented. So students, 31% of students who were suspended or expelled repeated their grade at least one time. And that's in contrast to only 5% of students who are held back who don't have those disciplinary incidences. We also know that about 1 in 7 of the students who have been suspended and expelled gets in contact with the juvenile justice system. So the Breaking School Rules report really established a likelihood that students who were suspended and expelled were going to be likely to come into contact with the juvenile justice system. And so folks know this report controls for lots of different factors, including race, class, gender, disability status, et cetera. And so it really helps establish this connection between what's happening in school and what's happening with our school disciplinary practices and young people's ability to graduate from school and to avoid coming into contact with the delinquency system. Next slide, please. And what we're going to talk about today as the things that we see as the elements of the school to prison pipeline are a couple of different things. So the policies and practices that we talked about, the things that impact the school to prison pipeline and further the school to prison pipeline. First of all, that there's racial and ethnic disparities in the way that this is happening, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. We also know that zero tolerance discipline and school suspension, so the use of zero tolerance rules that mean that students are going to be suspended or expelled from school no matter what, if certain things happen, if certain offenses are committed. And the overuse of school suspension as a reaction to student behavior also contribute to the school to prison pipeline. We also see that there's a criminalization of normal adolescent behavior. So things that 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago would not have resulted in such harsh punishments today are being criminalized or being told are crimes or serious offenses. We also know that there's an increase in police in schools and police presence in schools, so we're going to talk a little bit about the effect that that has. And lastly, we're going to talk briefly about the connection to this to a lot of other education issues such as high-stakes testing and funding and how that works. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and ask that folks can type in for a minute, if you have a second, what does the school-to-prison pipeline look like in your communities? And is this something that you're experiencing? And if you've started to address this, what challenges are you facing? One thing that we know that I just sort of laid out some general elements that we see about the school-to-prison pipeline, but it looks very different in every different community. So we'd love to hear from participants in the call who are experiencing this or who are working on this. What are some of the things that that you're seeing? And we'll probably maybe read some of those out loud, and we can help tailor our comments and tailor what we're talking about today to those. So maybe we'll just give a minute for folks to do that.
While you're able to answer, I've gotten a few questions about whether the hard copy of the presentation will be made available, and yes, we will be putting that on the CJJ website after this webinar.
And so I'm going to allow folks a moment to type in, but I'm going to, I know we're on a tight time frame and we want to leave lots of time for questions at the end. And so I'm going to perhaps move into the next section, which is talking a little bit about racial and ethnic disparities that exist. So can you, next slide, please. So an underlying feature of the school-to-prison pipeline is that the effects of it are falling much more harshly on young people of color throughout the country. And so folks can see from the graph that's on the screen that the percentage enrollment of white students versus students who are Hispanic, Black, Asian Pacific, and American Indian are in the column to the left-hand side of the graph, and that those are really disproportionate to the number of students that are experiencing both in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, and expulsions over the course of the year. So, so young people of color are experiencing these things much more frequently than their white counterparts. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that this problem is only increasing over the course of time. So what this slide shows is that from 1973 through 2006, not only have the use of suspensions and expulsions overall increased dramatically, but the disparity rates have also increased dramatically. So you see here that that the disparate use of suspension and expulsion for Black students from white students has gone up dramatically, both in the numbers of suspensions that folks are receiving, but also in the difference in the use of the rate of those. And so this is something that is really concerning to those of us that are working on this issue, because we know that this is a civil rights issue, that it is affecting our young people in different ways, and that's something that we need to address. And so next slide. This is based on the data from 2009. So as some folks may know on this call, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights collects data on the use of suspensions and expulsions. And the trends are remaining the same. So we know that for every one white student who receives an out-of-school suspension, a little over 3 Black students received an out-of-school suspension nationwide. And so this is really the reason that a lot of us are trying to address this work, that this overuse of suspension and expulsion is particularly concerning given the negative effects that we know happen from it. And so do we have any, I actually can't, I don't think, see the answers that folks are typing in. Do we have any answers or things that we want to share of folks talking about how the school-to-prison pipeline looks in their community?
Yes, I have one answer. So she says, overuse of suspensions and expulsions, there are no restorative justice practices. The school district is not recognizing as they are contributing to the school-to-prison pipeline, and that's from Coast, Pennsylvania.
Great, thank you. And thanks for sharing out in the audience there. So yeah, I think that that's a very common thing, this use of out-of-school suspensions to respond to all behavior. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk about one of the reasons why that happens so frequently. And so one of the things that we're seeing as a trend across the country is that adults are starting to recharacterize and are recharacterizing students' behavior, and they're doing that in a way that's criminalizing it. So they're referring to things and they're talking about things in ways that we used to not talk about them or used to not consider them. And so what I have here is just 3 examples that we've seen many times in different jurisdictions around the country, where pushing and shoving in a school, sometimes between very young people, between elementary school students, all of a sudden that is now becoming a battery. So we're not talking about this as a schoolyard fight and a way to deal with that in that context. Instead, we're talking about a battery, and we're referring that into the juvenile or criminal justice system. Kids are walking down the hall and someone swipes someone's headphones from them. Again, not acceptable behavior, but we're not dealing with that in a school context. Instead, we're calling it theft or we're calling it robbery and referring it into the court system. We've also seen this with things like talking back or insubordination. That's being considered disorderly conduct, or it's being considered disrupting the school function, and that now becomes an offense under the juvenile code. And so this recharacterization of behavior is really very concerning because it doesn't allow school administrators, school teachers, parents, communities to address the behavior and to teach lessons to young people. It doesn't allow young people to make those mistakes that result in young people being able to learn and to interact in appropriate ways. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over so we can talk a little bit about how these things interact with the increasing presence of police presence in our schools.
Thank you. I'm Harold Jordan from the ACLU of Pennsylvania, and I should start by saying that in addition to what was said in the introduction, that I bring a set of sensibilities or sensitivities and sensibilities that grow out of having been 19 years a parent in the school district of Philadelphia. Both of my kids went to the school district of Philadelphia from K to 12. I was also a district administrator at one point and have been on different sides of the line here in terms of responsibilities for addressing issues. So that's very important. And when I think about the role of law enforcement in schools, I'm thinking in part about what I would want to see in schools attended by my children. So that's really important. And then finally, in terms of introduction, I wanted to say that next week, the ACLU of Pennsylvania will be releasing a study called Beyond Zero Tolerance, Discipline and Policing in Pennsylvania's Public Schools, which is a statewide look at all 500 districts in the state of Pennsylvania. So it's not just focusing on one urban district of, say, Philadelphia, but just taking a broader look at the state of Pennsylvania, both out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, assignment to disciplined schools, and police contact with students. Next slide, please. Thank you. As you know, as I'm sure many of you know, that the police presence in schools has been on the rise, especially in the last, I would say, 15 to 17 years. And of course, every time there is a school shooting, probably the most notorious recent one was Newtown, Connecticut. The calls to expand police presence in school or some sort of an armed presence in school tend to increase on both the national level, the state level, and state legislatures, and some calls on the local levels. Another trend of note is that more types of incidents, and this is typically true in many or most states, is that more types of incidents now require police notification. In Pennsylvania, for example, there has been a change in state law that adds certain categories of offenses to things where the school must notify police. Another trend is that state and federal funding for cops in schools has expanded. That is something that we expect to hear more about. But districts are really struggling with this issue of funding and how federal and state funds should be used for cops, or should be used for counselors, or should be used for alternative programs. And so the policy issues are really significant here as to what kind of funding is sent to local school districts. But one thing is pretty clear, that there has been an increase, and there will likely be a bigger increase in the public funding for cops in schools. And then finally, in terms of my overview, Many zero-tolerance policies have broadened the definition of weapon. And we've seen this in a lot of states. It used to be a weapon was something would be considered a firearm. That's what federal law says. But now it includes other things. And then in Pennsylvania, it's been expanded further to say, to include anything that might be used as a weapon. So we have seen a broadening in the definition of what is a prohibited weapon in school. What concerns me, though, is that these developments have not been accompanied by a closer look at the actual experiences on the ground when policy is, especially at the point at which policy is being made, those policy decisions are not informed by what actually happens on the ground. Let's start with taking a quick look at the major types of security that exist in schools. And I will start, next slide please. I will start at the bottom by saying that almost every district in the country employs some form of security. And I would say some form of non-police security, school staff or private firm that contract staff, and they generally don't have police powers. They may sit at doors or staff metal detectors or provide some security in parking lots and things of that sort. The two major types of police, though, are school police officers. The definition varies from state to state, but these are, in all cases, sworn police officers. In other words, they're certified by some agency, and they are typically on the staff of the district. Either they're individual officers who work for the district, or there are districts such as Philadelphia which has its own police department. And then the other category of police is what's known as school resource officers. This has gotten a lot of attention nationwide because it is the model of policing that is most on the rise, on the increase. These are, once again, typically sworn police officers, but in most states they work for outside agencies, but they are assigned full-time to schools. There's some variation as to who actually has command and control of these school resource officers, but they typically work for outside agencies but are assigned to schools full-time. So, for example, they could work for the township, they could work for the county. In Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State Patrol has a school resource officer program where districts can buy into it on a fee-for-service basis. And then finally, I would say that the practices vary substantially regarding whether these officers, at least the police ones, the school police officers and the school resource officers, are armed. Where they are armed, they typically carry the full complement of weapons that a cop on the street would carry. That's a fairly typical situation in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, but it's not 100% true across the board. The most significant thing that I think we need to consider is who has the power to arrest. Of all these different forms of security, who has the power to arrest, detain, interrogate, issue citations, and to carry out searches of students. Next slide, please. And so I want to focus a few minutes on concerns about police in schools, what we have found in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. There is a lack of evidence that stationing police in schools makes schools safer. That's a big statement, but the way that I have looked at it is by looking at actually the trends in violent incidents, the most serious incidents that occur in schools. And we are not seeing a trend, to the extent to which any of this has really been analyzed, we're not seeing any kind of trend where those rates go down as you bring police in schools. Even in school districts that have had police or SROs for 4 to 5 years, we're not generally seeing across the board any kind of a decrease in the rates of most serious incidents. One of the problems with most of the studies that have been done is that most of the program assessments are really based on opinion surveys and not an actual look at trends regarding actual incidents that happen in schools. A second concern is that increased school policing may have negative impacts. I mean, if police are assigned to schools full-time, then they become a part of the school culture. They're there in the halls. They talk to students. And there's been a lot of concern about police involvement in enforcing the code of conduct, and in ways that may make incidents blow up and be worse or escalate in ways that might not have happened. I can give you one really great example from Western Pennsylvania, the Western Pennsylvania district that had an SRO in the school. There was a young man talking on a cell phone during class time. He was standing outside the classroom in the hallway. Obviously, it's a violation of school rules. Shouldn't be on your cell phone when you're in school, and you should be in class and not out in the hallways. Well, the SRO talks to the student, grabs the student's arm. There's some dispute about what happens beyond that. But the next thing you know, that a scuffle ensues and the kid is shot with a taser. Now, when I look at that incident, I don't start at the point where the officer is grabbing the students and there may have been an altercation. I ask the question, well, wait a minute. You know, cell phone violations are routine in schools. It should never have led to this kind of action. It should not have gone down that path. Experienced educators, even inexperienced educators, are used to dealing with things like cell phone violations. This is not something that would have escalated to that level had not a police officer been there. Another concern is that districts generally do a poor job of monitoring the consequences and aftermath of police involvement. I would say that the data you can get from districts is either non-existent or shaky at best about what happens once a young person is turned over to the police. And once again, I would say that it's not just about arrest. Police engage with young people in other ways too, such as issuing summary citations. Those things may have consequences too. In Pennsylvania, for example, these result in convictions in adult court. Although there's no incarceration, there may be fines. These kids will have a record, and they go before a judge generally without any kind of representation. It's not something that happens in the juvenile system. Even the formal guidelines that exist are fairly minimal, the guidelines regarding policing in schools, and especially when it comes to prohibitions on what police cannot be involved in, and restrictions on student searches. Generally speaking, an outside police person would have to have probable cause in order to search a student. It is not clear in school district policies and in law enforcement policies what happens when you have a police station full-time in schools, as in the school resource officer program, where you have a police person who is both a law enforcement officer, a counselor and mentor, and may actually teach some courses in class, usually about drug education. So what standing does this person have? Is this person a school official, or is this person, should this person be treated like an outside police person? I would argue that SROs are at all times law enforcement officers and should be treated as such no matter what else they may do in schools. I want to close with a series of sort of recommendations for what we think districts and law enforcement should do in this area. One is that we need to minimize the use of law enforcement in school discipline matters, restricting police involvement to serious criminal matters. Number two, school districts should review the misconduct and incident patterns in schools that are staffed by students as part of their evaluation of the overall program effectiveness of any police programs that may exist in schools. And number three, revise agreements between law enforcement departments and school districts to explicitly restrict the roles of school police, as I said before, and school resource officers in student searches and interrogations. And number four, the security staff that may be there, all of them, police and non-police, need to be trained in de-escalation, mediation, adolescent development, bias-based, and sexual harassment. And I want to say the issue of sexual harassment is a big issue from what we've seen with students in terms of the interactions between young women and police. Working with students with disabilities and some recommendations. I'm happy if folks would want to contact me with further questions. I can be reached at hjordan, HJORDAN, @aclupa.org. Thank you very much. And we do have a question for you. We want to know what kind of policing and security you have in your schools.
While we wait for an answer for that, I actually have another answer that came in while you were talking about the policies in their state. Someone said, in Kentucky, there's a fairly new law called the abuse of teacher that involves kids who curse a teacher and are uncooperative. A lot of schools abuse this new law when some of this behavior can be handled by the school themselves and not receive charges.
That's interesting. By the way, I believe it was the Kentucky Supreme Court that this spring issued a ruling essentially throwing out statements made by a young person to a school resource officer. It ruled that the questioning was unlawful. So that's the other thing that's happening in Kentucky. But we can move on to the next section. Thank you very much.
I have one person who said that they have school resource officers, and another person who said school resource officers based contracted outside police department for other services.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll let other questions come in as I get them. I can read them out loud. So do we want to hand it over to Marsha?
Absolutely.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be participating in this important webinar. So the next set of slides are based on a qualitative study that I've done with young people who've been suspended from mainstream schools. And each of the slides start with a direct quote from one of the young people that I interviewed. And I'm really going to encourage you to read that quote because I think it brings to life the data about the school-to-prison pipeline. And in the course of doing this research, one thing became very clear, which is that the kids experience suspension much as the adults who we work with. CCA works with people both in the adult and the juvenile system, much as the adults experience their path through the criminal justice. And so even for kids who are not arrested, the process of suspension, and for the most part I'm talking about out-of-school suspension, social reproduction. It prepares them actually for a life in the criminal justice system. So with respect to the kinds of behaviors that lead to suspension, there really is a myth that schools are dangerous places. And despite some tragic and very public incidents, schools are remarkably safe places. Very few criminal incidents at all of any sort take place on school grounds. And even where there is a criminal incident, most of those are nonviolent, don't involve any kinds of violence. And last but not least, even when violence is involved, if you dig deeper, you see that it's about criminalizing behaviors. So assault or violence perpetrated by arms, legs, kicking, scratching, are now called assaults by personal weapons. Schools themselves don't have a common definition of what violence is. There was a survey done among New York State administrators that found some administrators did not, I say not, classify weapons possession as a violent infraction, and yet others rated pushing online to get to the curb as an extremely violent act. And I bring that up to point out that there is no common definition of what behaviors should merit out-of-school suspension. It really varies to some extent incident by incident, let alone school or district by district. Next slide, please.
And Marsha, I advanced the slide. I just want to say we're getting a little bit of feedback, or kind of sounds like moving around or shuffling. So I wanted to give you a heads up.
Okay.
Anything you can do.
Okay. Let me try to get closer to the phone.
Yep, that sounds perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So with respect to what happens to kids who get suspended, They have what's called a disciplinary hearing, which kids liken to a trial. And they are very ill prepared to understand or negotiate that. Now, contrary to what's often heard, parents typically do show up at hearings, parents or guardians or grandparents. But neither the kids nor the parents often understand what's going on. They don't know their rights. They are allowed to have a representative with them, including an attorney, but people don't know that. And even if they knew that, most of the kids that we work with, the families cannot afford an attorney, and they don't have the right for a publicly appointed attorney. This becomes even more important when we think about the long-term outcomes of suspension. The impact and the increased rate of dropping out, the pathway into the criminal justice system from suspension alone, not just school-based arrests, and from long-term employment if you don't have a high school degree, and from getting into college and advancing your life. It is for this reason that the Dignity in Schools campaign, which we're going to speak about more in the next section, has developed a model school disciplinary code that recommends that students and their families be afforded public counsel if they cannot afford to hire their own attorney. And this recommendation has been endorsed by the ABA as well. Next slide, please. Zero tolerance policies and harsh school discipline flies in the face of what we now know to be adolescent brain development. Adolescents display psychosocial immaturity in at least 4 areas. Poor resistance to peer influence, attitudes about taking risks, their future orientation, and impulse control. And harsh school disciplinary practices are completely at odds with the challenges of adolescent development. In fact, zero tolerance policies exacerbate the normative challenges of adolescence. A lot of the young people we work with have lives that are beset by trauma of one sort or another, mental health issues, stress, anxiety. And suspension actually exacerbates those mental health conditions. That is one of the reasons that the American Psychological Association called for an end to zero tolerance. And again, I want you to focus on what Roland said as about what happened to him in his suspension. He sat there, and I don't know what literally was said in that hearing, but what Roland heard was that he was a bad kid and would amount to nothing. And he felt like a nobody, quoting Roland, and that hurted him. So we're really doing damage to kids' psychological well-being. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about Ray. Ray was on a school bus with his younger brother, and he saw his younger brother move a knife, a pen knife, but a knife nonetheless, from his bag to his pocket. And Ray reached over, grabbed the knife from his brother. The school bus monitor saw it. When they arrived at school, both were taken to the principal's office, and both were suspended for a year. Right? Now, Ray knew that there was a no weapons policy, but he thought he was doing the right thing by taking the knife away from his younger brother. This illuminates the school-to-prison pipeline use of what we in the criminal justice system have become familiar with as mandatory. So zero tolerance policies grew out of the 1994 Safe and Gun-Free Schools Act that tied mandatory suspension policies to receiving federal school aid. Since then, it has been applied to a range of behaviors, not just weapons, not just drugs, not just violence, but insubordination, chronic truancy, rather than looking for other mechanisms to address problematic behaviors. And what this simply does is erode young people's sense of trust in authoritative systems, that the system can't even take the time to hear what we would call mitigating circumstances. Next slide, please. So when kids are suspended out of school, they often go to what's called either an alternative school or alternative program. And there's many definitions of alternative schools. In fact, there's some a really sort of proud history of alternative schools during the 60s called freedom schools. But what we now have for the most part are disciplinary alternative schools. And these schools undermine a young person's right to education. They're often characterized by incredibly high levels of security and surveillance. And you could see that in Danella's description of how she came into the school every day. They have shorter school days in one of the areas that we work. Alternative school students at best go to school from about 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. Some alternative programs are 3 hours a day. And if you're sent to homebound, you get 1 hour a day of instruction. And also, alternative schools and programs typically have no after-school activities. So they're shorter days. Kids are left to go to the streets, go home, and they can't partake in the very activities that often tie marginal students to school. I know that when my son was growing up, he went to school because he wanted to be on the lacrosse team. He didn't go to school because he wanted school, but he went to school so he could stay on the lacrosse team. So we're removing one other incentive for kids to stay in school. Next slide, please. So much as the criminal justice system, when kids finish their term of suspension, they face enormous collateral, or what we actually call lifetime consequences. So the consequences, to repeat what's been said very briefly, suspension increases the likelihood of dropping out, which increases the likelihood of unemployment. Suspension increases the likelihood of dropping out, which increases the likelihood of incarceration. Bruce Western's research shows that for African American young men who drop out of school, they have a 60% chance of spending some time in a jail or prison by the time they're 30 years old. And lastly, even for kids who don't drop out, suspension is on their record, and it's now being used as a barrier to college education. The Common Application, used by more than 500 schools in the country, has a question on its application that requires applicants to disclose whether or not they've been subjected to a school disciplinary action, suspension, right, or expulsion. And the guidance counselor gets their own form to be filled out to detail the suspension incidents. Most folks don't know that, but there are long-term consequences of suspension that can really harm a young person's life going forward. We're closing doors to all kinds of opportunities, even if they don't directly get a criminal record based on a school-based arrest. Last slide for me, anyway. So to segue into solutions, there are things that we can do about this. And young people themselves have their own ideas, and I've listed suggestions that came directly from the voices of young people. And on the top of the list is patient, caring teachers and school staff. Virtually every kid that I have spoken to could give me a rather detailed story of an adult in the school who is willing and able to make the time and space to work through the problems with young people, to help them pull themselves together when they got angry and they were lashing out in an inappropriate way. And those are the kinds of solutions that we have to be able to support, resource, fund, train on rather than what we're doing now, which is simply pushing kids into a lifetime of unemployment, incarceration, and despair. I'm going to turn it over to Fernando, who's going to talk about more tools and ways and examples that we can really dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline.
Thank you, Marsha. I appreciate it. And I would like to say before I talk a little bit more about the school, Dignity in the Schools campaign that I'm proud to be presented here with such amazing people from Kaitlin from Advancement Project, Harold and Marsha, and also thanks to the Coalition for Juvenile Justice for inviting us to present about the school-to-prison pipeline. And as Harold stated in the beginning, I also was my sister guardian at one point when I was living in Birmingham, Alabama. So I know firsthand how it is for immigrants and people of color to deal with the school system. And unfortunately, I also have one of my brothers is incarcerated. So I know firsthand how it is to experience all these issues when it comes to the school-to-prison pipeline, but also the criminal justice system. So this is what kept me going, and this is why I joined the Dignity in the Schools campaign. And if you please get me to the next slide, I can actually talk a little bit more about who we are as a Dignity in the Schools campaign and what do we do, right? So you might be familiar with our name. You might get our newsletters. But basically, we are a national coalition of more than 70 organizations in 21 states. Because recently Texas joined us. We have also members in Texas right now as for this week. And we have come together to challenge the school-to-prison pipeline, to challenge the school push-out. We believe that the students are not dropping out. We believe that students are being pushed out of the system. And so we came together to advocate for the human right to education and dignity. And because of our approach, we also have come to develop some solutions to the problem of the students push out. And I'm going to talk in the next slide about the Dignity in the Schools campaign model code for education and dignity, in which we actually lay out solutions to some of these problems in the school setting. So if you get me, please, to the next slide, I will kind of like talk a little bit about where we're coming from when it's come to talk about the model code. So for a few years, the Dignity in the Schools campaign, I think over 4 or 5 years, had developed different policies, a set of policies for the school district and states and elected officials and legislators to deal with the problem of the students push out. And so we compile all this information together, and a lot of our Dignity in the Schools campaign members help us to do that. And we put this document in several drafts. We actually brought this draft for the Dignity in the Schools campaign model code to the people in the ground. I think we went to about 8 different states and talked to parents and students about what are the best practices that are in place that are helping to keep the students in the schools and don't push them out. So basically, we came out with the all best practices in research and all these policies that are going to help to establish the school-to-prison pipeline. Our approach, though, it is pretty much based on the fundamental human rights to education. And because of that, we have developed our Dignity in the Schools campaign model code. In the next slide, you will see that we have developed in 5 principles of human rights. As you can see, the chapter is divided in the education, the right to education, the right to participation, the dignity, the freedom from discrimination, and the monitoring and accountability. And in Chapter 1, for example, when it comes to education, we address how school districts need to pay attention to the full potential of the children and the youth. We talk about some of the elements for the core programs in the right to education. We talk about ensuring equity in education. In Chapter 2, we talk about the role of the stakeholders. We talk about the steps to ensure meaningful role in the decision-making process in the school system, the rights of children and youth, the rights of parents and guardians, And Chapter 3, which is one of our chapters that is a little bit larger per se, it's a little bit thick. We talk about the school climate and the discipline and some policies for preventive and positive approach. That could be positive behavior intervention services. That could be restorative justice. That could be 100% respect, and all these models that are out there that are helping to keep the students in the school. And also how to avoid the criminalization of youth in the school and the right to remain in the schools. And I can go on with the description of the chapters, but I also want to point, I'm going to jump chapter number 4 and go to the monitoring and accountability, because it is also something that we need to pay attention as a base building groups, right? When we're campaigning out there, and we might get some policies passed, we might get some changes at the school district level, but also it will require an intentional accountability campaign, making sure that the school district actually implement what is being done and the changes that our members are pushing out there in the school district. And then the next slide, I would just pick one example of the limiting the role of police in Oakland School District. But Dignity in Schools campaign, like I said earlier, we work in about 21 states, and we believe that there is no national campaign. We don't have a local campaign. So our main priority is to build members' capacity, and same positive changes are happening in Boston. Same changes are happening in Minneapolis and in Minnesota and Denver in Colorado and Wake County, North Carolina, and you name it, right? But for this particular purpose, I'm going to talk a little bit about the one of our members, Black Organizing Project, and how they actually got to pass a given policy, but also how they got to come out with a specific role limitation for the role of police in the schools. And Black Organizing Project actually started doing the school to prison pipeline work, but start paying attention more about what's going on in the schools after Raheem Brown was shot and killed by one of the school police officers for the Oakland School District in 2011. And sooner after that, a few months after that, they actually, which is interesting, they come out with a Public Record Act, trying to get more information about the number of arrests, the number of the money, how much money goes to the police in the schools. They wanted to see the statistics of the referrals to law enforcement and arrests segregated by race, complaints, what kind of training manual they use, what kind of hiring process they use when they come to hire the police or the school resource officers. And they got some information, but the Oakland School District kind of like told them that they didn't have all that information. So they got very few information, and then they started a campaign with whatever information they could get. They started a campaign called BUS, and it's pretty much stands for Battling Our School System, and it was because, again, the criminalization of youth in the Oakland School District, and they because of that campaign, it's like an umbrella campaign, and they were able to pass the grievance policy. And also right now they're talking about the memorandum of understanding for the role of police in the schools, even though Oakland already have its own police in the school, its own school police department. They also have city police as well, so, and they weren't regulated whatsoever under these school police, so they're now campaigning for come out with an MOU. And this is the beauty about being working in Dignity in the Schools campaign. They got to exchange information with Denver, Padres and Jóvenes Unidos, with Pasadena, and some people in San Francisco about the MOUs that they introduced, and that's what they're pushing for right now. But before I continue talking about the MOU, I would like to say that the Chapter 5, right, when I make reference to the accountability piece and how intentional we should be when it comes to hold the school system accountable after the changes that are made, the Black Organizing Project was successful, passing the grievance policy. And the grievance policy, and we're going to send this information after the webinar, but pretty much ensures that parents and students and anyone can find a complaint if they believe that the school resource officers or the police are misbehaving or being criminalized and something like that without the fear of being retaliated. So one of the things that they are facing right now is that although they were able to pass the grievance policy, now school district and administrators don't know about the policy. And although the policy actually stated that the school district needs to collect the report, needs to collect the data at least twice a year, they're not doing it. So intentionally, the Black Organizing Project right now, along with Public Council and ACLU of Northern California, are starting this accountability campaign to make sure people know about the process and people hold the school system accountable. And this is the other curious thing about, not curious, but one of the things we recommend all the time is to partner, is to identify all the organizations that are working around the school-to-prison pipeline, because when they first introduced the Public Record Act, asking for the information, they were told that they didn't have all that information. But in 2012, when they introduced the second one, they did it with partners, with the ACLU of Northern California and Public Council, and they actually got all the information that they were told in the first place that they didn't collect. So that is why the Dignity in Schools campaign is made out of base building groups and those that are affected by the problem, parents and students. But also we have a lot of advocacy groups and a lot of legal groups in our campaign. And it only makes sense for us to work together and only makes sense for us to hold the school system accountable. So I know it's almost, the time is almost over, but I just wanted to encourage you one more time to identify those organizations in your hometown where you're working and make sure that you connect with them. Make sure that you have open communication with them, because we're losing life. I mean, the school-to-prison pipeline is real, and we actually losing students not only to the juvenile justice system, but we're losing the students. The students are getting killed because of the criminalization in the schools, and we can't afford to continue doing that. So if you want to know more about where the Dignity in Schools campaign have members, feel free to email me at Fernando at Dignity in Schools campaign. My information and my cell phone number is actually in the website, so you can actually get it out of the website, and I'll be happy to follow up with you.
Thank you, Fernando. Kaitlin, I know you have 1 or 2 slides left. I just wanted to give you a time check that we only have a few minutes, and I also want to give people time for questions.
For sure. So I am happy to sum them up in 2 sentences. So going on to the next slide is another example of a great campaign that was led by local leaders in Buffalo Public Schools and in Buffalo, New York. And they were able to work with the school district there and demand changes to the way that the school district was handling suspensions and expulsions by adopting a new code of conduct that really prioritized doing interventions in schools. We're going to have that resource available to you all for those who are interested. So I echo everything that Fernando just said about the importance of that reform being community-driven and community-led. And then on the next slide, which is our last slide, we sort of have some recommendations and sort of overall thoughts for how to end the school-to-prison pipeline and how to dismantle the pipeline in your communities. So we know that we want to improve codes of conduct to stop schools from suspending and excluding students from school for minor misbehavior. We want to examine the root causes of racial disparities. So when these racial disparities exist, we want to address them and talk about why they're happening. It's really important, as folks have said, to limit the role of law enforcement in school to only handling and addressing the most serious crimes and to really reduce their presence on our campuses. We want to see an increase in counseling and community intervention resources so that our young people are learning how to address these problems that they're seeing. And then really the most important thing we saved for last, which is how do we give youth and parents a real voice in creating and implementing positive school discipline. So with that, we're happy to open it up for questions to any of the panelists. So, yeah.
Okay, so if you have any questions, you can feel free to type them into the questions box. Like I said, if you're using one question on the phone, let me see if I can unmute. Oh, I have a question. Dominique?
Trained as a school actor. Well, that's a parent or grandparent that makes a big difference.
Okay, I guess she stepped off. If anyone else has any questions, or Dominica, if you are having trouble speaking, you can just enter them into the questions box. Okay, I have one question. Let me just read it out loud from David Marimon. I'm sorry if I am. Oh, sorry, no, that's right. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do you all feel that there are any appropriate uses of school resource officers?
This is Marsha. I'll take a stab at that. There are, obviously, to the extent that there are what we would, and I know it's not easy to come to a common sense definition, but to the extent that there are criminal activities going on in school that can be differentiated from the risk-taking and the limit testing that is part of adolescent development, of course, there's a role for police in that. So I hate to give the most egregious examples, but in those instances, if a young person comes to school pointing a gun and grabs someone, that absolutely is something that falls under police purview. The problem is that we don't look at limiting the role of police. We've been looking at expanding the role of police. And with all due respect to school administrators, they've actually, in some instances, passed the buck and are very comfortable and are almost, relying on police to do things that hall monitors used to do, deans of students used to do. So I think that there's less difficulty in thinking about when the police should be involved and more difficulty in thinking about rolling back the expansive use of police in schools.
This is Harold Jordan from the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I would echo what Marsha said, and the particular, there is a legitimate role for police in school in terms of addressing certain very particular incidents. What I do want to challenge, though, is this notion that of police being there full-time in schools as a regular part of school staff, which is the school resource officer model. With the exception of really, truly exceptional circumstances in which there have been maybe a series of incidents or an ongoing problem, I don't really see that as something that's legitimate or supportable, the full-time presence there.
Okay, thank you, Harold. I have another question from Karen South-Jones. Can anyone address the implementation of restorative practices in schools and their impact on this issue?
So this is Kaitlin, and Marsha, I feel like you might be the best person to answer this question, but I'm happy to take a first stab. Restorative practices has been a great alternative in schools that have been able to use it. And so restorative practices, for those who don't know, are the idea of bringing together, there's a lot of different manifestations of it, but bringing together the alleged victim and the alleged offender to really talk about what happened and to use the community to come up with a solution or to address that problem. And it can range from things like community conferencing to restorative justice circles to practices that really dig deep into the problem in the classroom. And so yes, there are definitely uses of that in reducing the reliance on suspensions and expulsions and also at getting to root causes of the problem.
Yeah, I would just add to that, this is Harold Jordan again, I would just add to that in that our experience in Philadelphia has been that using sort of restorative practices or restorative justice helps improve the overall communication within the schools. So it may be useful, both in the context of a particular conflict, but also it becomes the way through which some of the conversations, the tension-filled conversations and the conversations where people are clearly on other sides of the line in terms of their interests, get sorted out. And in schools where that practice is used amongst all of the folks, including staff, you've seen, at least from the few small studies that have been done, an overall reduction in both serious violence and in some kinds of disorder. I mean, we've seen that in at least one high school in Philadelphia that used to be plagued by fires in the bathroom and arson, in other words, and things like that. When the school made a commitment, starting at the principal level, to really incorporate sort of restorative practices into the culture of the school, that the overall, there was a decline, a substantial decline in the number of incidents like that. But the reality is that there have not been large-scale studies of this, but restorative justice, restorative practices show promise.
And I would, this is Marsha Weissman. I would add, sort of taking off to what Harold said, it's really thinking, I think, a bit differently than we've been thinking in the last decade or so about the whole culture of a school. Interventions being one part of it, even positive interventions. But I know in our experience, so CCA runs an after-school program for kids who are pushed out of the mainstream school. I mean, we wish we weren't doing it in this venue, but absent our presence, these kids literally have nothing to do. And one of the things that we've done at the beginning of every school year is engage the young people themselves in developing a code of conduct. If you, much like we know in the juvenile justice system, and my interview showed this, when you interview kids about what the disputes are, you know, the ones that do involve some measure of physical violence, and by that I mean really sort of pushing and shoving and slapping. I mean, you could just, you know, go gray trying to figure out, you know, he said. Like, we had an incident where actually one boy went to hit a girl because the girl had slurped, S-L-U-R-P, to him. And, you know, I'm scratching my head, like, why would that merit that kind of response? But the kids, you know, one day are sort of the victims and the next day are the perpetrators. And they don't like being the victims. And I don't think they like being the perpetrators either. And if you engage them at the front end in thinking through what a healthy, peaceable learning environment can look like, they begin to own that behavior rather than simply handing something to them that they won't necessarily read, and if they read it, they may frankly not understand it. So it is about changing school climate and putting the energy in at the front end to do that. And it involves, you know, students, parents, teachers, and other school staff and administrators.
All right, thank you. I want to say thank you to our presenters. That's our time. If you have any further questions or you submitted one and we didn't get a chance to get to it, you can email me, Katie Mercier at mercier@juvjustice.org. And once again, I want to thank all of our presenters and Alex Terapoli for putting this webinar together. We'll post it on the website, the recording, and the PowerPoint presentation. And I believe we have an email that we will send out with additional resources in the next 24 hours. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.